The vastness of the North Atlantic Ocean became the principal stage for the most decisive and brutal struggle of the Second World War. It was here, in the cold, unforgiving waters, that the very lifeline of Great Britain, its convoys of food, fuel, and arms, was constantly under threat. The German submarine fleet, known as U-boats, were predators of unparalleled stealth and effectiveness, operating with a ruthless efficiency that nearly starved the island nation into submission. Winston Churchill himself would later confess that the U-boat menace was the only thing that truly kept him awake at night during the dark days of the conflict. The convoys were the vulnerable arteries of the Allied effort, stretching for miles across the grey, churning sea, guarded by a woefully insufficient number of escort vessels. These merchant mariners and naval escorts faced not just the natural dangers of gales and ice, but the terrifying prospect of a torpedo strike emerging from the depths without warning. The Germans employed wolf-pack tactics, coordinating dozens of U-boats to overwhelm the defenses, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard for tens of thousands of Allied sailors and vital cargo. For a long time, the U-boat command, led by Admiral Karl Donitz, felt a profound, almost arrogant sense of untouchable supremacy beneath the waves. They believed their technology and their tactics had given them an insurmountable advantage over the Allied navies. The losses were astronomical, threatening to cut the supply line that was absolutely essential for Britain to continue fighting the Axis powers. This period was the Battle of the Atlantic at its most desperate and savage, where every single ship that safely reached port was considered a major victory. The sheer scale of the danger fostered a need for an audacious, high-risk solution that went against every established naval doctrine of the time. A new type of warrior was required, one who could match the U-boat stealth with sheer, brutal aggression and board the enemy in the open sea. The submarine force of the Kriegsmarine was not merely a fleet of ships, it was a carefully honed and highly effective instrument of economic warfare designed for maximum destruction. Admiral Donitz had perfected the wolf-pack concept, utilizing radio communication to guide groups of U-boats to converge on a single convoy simultaneously from multiple directions. This tactic made the escort ship's task of defense virtually impossible, as they could not be everywhere at once to detect the silent, approaching torpedoes. German submariners were celebrated as heroes of the Rhine, symbols of a superior maritime power that was crippling the efforts of the British Empire. Their U-boats were sophisticated marvels of engineering, capable of long-range patrols deep into the Allied shipping lanes, even reaching the waters off the American coast. The primary mission was simple and brutal: sink every merchant vessel they could find to stop the flow of material across the Atlantic. The threat was compounded by the fact that the U-boats were operating under a veil of complete secrecy due to the unbreakable code cipher system known as Enigma. Every U-boat communicated its position, its targets, and its movements using signals encrypted by this incredibly complex electromechanical machine. This meant that the Allies were always one step behind, unable to predict where the next devastating wolf-pack attack would occur. The sheer power of the U-boat campaign fostered a dangerous sense of infallibility and overconfidence within the German naval command. They believed that their submersibles were virtually immune to capture or boarding, especially in the treacherous conditions of the open, stormy ocean. Why would any sane foe attempt to jump onto a steel tube in rough seas while under fire, when the easier path was to sink it from a distance? This deep-seated underestimation of their adversary would prove to be one of the most critical strategic blunders of the entire war. They never accounted for the sheer audacity and specialized training of a particular group of British combatants who were prepared to do the unthinkable. Into this perilous maritime arena stepped the Royal Marines, a legendary corps with a history stretching back hundreds of years, whose motto is per mer, per terram, by sea, by land. The Marines were a unique hybrid force, trained for naval duties and land combat, making them the perfect candidates for unconventional, amphibious, and desperate missions. As the U-boat crisis escalated, a select few of these Marines were quietly pulled aside for an extremely dangerous, top-secret specialization program. They were tasked with transforming into the world's first true maritime commandos, trained specifically for the terrifying task of storming a fully operational enemy vessel at sea. This mission was entirely unprecedented in modern naval warfare, requiring a blend of immense courage, precise timing, and ruthless efficiency. Their training was incredibly rigorous, simulating the chaos of boarding a wet, slippery conning tower from a small boat violently tossed by waves. They had to be proficient with explosives for breaching hatches, experts in close-quarters combat for fighting in the confined, dark corridors of a submarine, and utterly fearless. The objective was not merely to destroy the U-boat, but to capture it intact, or at least to secure the vital intelligence materials it carried before it could be scuttled. Specifically, they were hunting the Enigma coding machines and the daily key settings, the physical objects that held the key to unlocking German naval communications. These men were taught to move with speed, precision, and silence, turning a heavily armed submarine into a floating, time-sensitive intelligence target. Their existence and their true purpose were veiled in the highest levels of secrecy, known only to a very small circle of naval and intelligence commanders. The men understood that the success of their mission could literally shorten the war by years, or, if they failed, they would almost certainly be killed or captured. They were the tip of the spear in a desperate race against time, where the intelligence war was being fought not just in code-breaking huts, but on the open ocean. The Royal Marines were ready to face the impossible, to board a moving enemy vessel that was prepared to fight to the death to protect its secrets. The strategic concept that would eventually involve the Royal Marines boarding U-boats under fire was a direct response to the frustration felt by the Allied intelligence community. The brilliant minds at Bletchley Park, the famed center of British code-breaking, could only crack the Enigma code if they had the current, physical key setting sheets. Without these critical documents, the hundreds of intercepted U-boat messages remained an impenetrable wall of seemingly random letters. A desperate operation, often referred to as a high-stakes capture plan, was conceived to physically seize the necessary materials from a U-boat before the crew could destroy them. This required a complete shift in naval thinking, moving from the purely destructive goal of sinking U-boats to the incredibly risky objective of capturing them. The intelligence value of a single Enigma machine and its corresponding code books vastly outweighed the value of sinking a dozen enemy submarines. The naval strategy had to be adjusted to bait the U-boat to the surface, damage it enough to prevent immediate submersion, and then hold it long enough for the commandos to board. This entire sequence of events had to take place in a matter of minutes, usually under extreme duress from the German crew, the elements, and other nearby enemy vessels. The plan was incredibly complex, involving coordination between destroyers, corvettes, and the small, fast boats carrying the boarding parties. The name Operation Pucker was often used by the men involved, reflecting the nerve-wracking intensity and the sheer terror of the mission they were about to undertake. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the specific locations on the U-boat where explosive charges would disable scuttling mechanisms to the exact positioning of the boarding teams. The Marine commandos were trained to target the radio room and the captain's cabin immediately upon entry, as these were the most likely places for the code materials. Failure meant not only the loss of the intelligence prize but also the likely annihilation of the boarding party by a scuttling U-boat crew determined to prevent the secrets from falling into enemy hands. This was a calculated gamble, a measure of last resort that depended entirely on the bravery and speed of the Royal Marines to execute a near impossible feat of arms. The moment a U-boat was forced to the surface, typically by depth charges or sustained fire from an escort vessel, the deadly clock began ticking for the boarding party. The challenge was immense. A U-boat's smooth, curved casing was designed to shed water and resist pressure, making it inherently difficult to climb and hold onto, especially in heavy seas. The commandos had to transfer from their larger escort ship to tiny, highly maneuverable rubber boats, often called dinghies, in the middle of a battle. This transfer itself was fraught with danger, as the small boats could easily be swamped or crushed between the larger vessels in the chaotic waves. The U-boat crew, knowing that capture meant exposure of their secrets, would typically fight fiercely to repel boarders and sink their own vessel. German machine guns were frequently manned and fired from the conning tower, forcing the Marines to approach through a hail of bullets and shrapnel. The time window was extremely narrow because the German crew's first instinct upon surfacing would be to prime and open the scuttling valves to flood and sink the submarine. The objective was not to conduct a prolonged siege, but to execute a lightning-fast, shock and/or assault that neutralized the U-boat crew's resistance. The Marines were equipped with grappling hooks, specialized lines, and custom-made magnetic boarding ladders to help them ascend the slick, barnacle-covered hull. Each man carried an essential combination of personal weapons, demolition charges, and waterproof bags for securing the vital documents. The coordination had to be flawless, with the escort vessel providing suppressive fire to distract the U-boat's gunners without damaging the fragile submarine's hull too much. The commandos understood that the greatest danger was not the German resistance but the violent, uncontrolled thrashing of the wounded submarine in the water. This act of boarding a fighting, sinking vessel in the open ocean was a pure test of nerves and skill, requiring a level of cold-blooded courage rarely demanded in any military operation. The concept was the very definition of a high-risk, high-reward mission, where success could change the entire strategic balance of the war. The initial phase of the assault, the silent approach, was often the most psychologically taxing for the Royal Marines boarding teams. After successfully transferring to their small inflatable boats, they would paddle toward the crippled U-boat, relying entirely on the cover of darkness or a thick sea mist. The noise of their movement had to be minimal, as the U-boat, though damaged, still retained highly sensitive acoustic listening equipment. Every stroke of the paddle, every creak of the small boat, felt amplified in the immense silence of the mid-Atlantic night. The German crew, either in a daze from the depth charge attacks or actively preparing to fight and scuttle, would be hyper-alert to any movement on the surface. This approach was truly a deadly game of hide-and-seek, played out on a massive, heaving stage of water where the slightest mistake meant disaster. The Marines' hearts would pound as the black, menacing silhouette of the U-boat's conning tower gradually loomed larger and larger in the gloom. They had to time their approach perfectly to ride the large ocean swells, using the waves to mask their final push toward the steel hull. Any illumination, even a momentary flashlight beam, would instantly betray their position and draw a lethal burst of machine gun fire from the enemy vessel. The goal was to reach the blind spotter of the U-boat, the area directly beneath the deck guns and conning tower where the German lookouts could not easily spot them. This required remarkable boat handling skills, maneuvering the small craft right up against the unpredictable, violent motion of the wounded submarine. Once alongside, they were practically clinging to the enemy vessel, exposed, vulnerable, and completely committed to the operation. There was no turning back, as the time it took to retreat would give the U-boat crew ample opportunity to fully scuttle the boat and sink with their secrets. The moment of contact with the hull was the point of no return, where stealth ended and the fierce, close-quarters combat began in earnest. The boarding was always a brutal, lightning-fast exercise in organized violence, immediately drawing the furious and desperate attention of the U-boat crew. The instant the first Marine made contact with the casing, the German gunners, if still alive and positioned, would open fire, turning the deck into a hellish torrent of tracers and shrapnel. The Marines were trained to ignore this incoming fire, focusing entirely on scaling the hull as quickly as possible to neutralize the resistance on the conning tower. They were literally climbing into a storm of lead and water, knowing that the smallest slip or moment of hesitation could mean being swept away or killed instantly. The sound of the machine guns, mixed with the crashing of the waves and the shouts of the combatants, created a deafening, terrifying symphony of battle. The crucial first objective was to secure the conning tower hatch, the literal gateway into the submarine's inner workings and the location of most of the critical intelligence. A small team of Marines, often the most experienced and heavily armed, would rapidly scale the tower and either kill or force the surrender of the gunners and lookouts. Other teams simultaneously worked to secure the deck, covering the main hatches to prevent German sailors from emerging with weapons or from preparing to scuttle the boat. The Marines moved with a practiced, almost robotic efficiency, their training taking over in the face of absolute terror and chaos. They knew that speed was their only true defense, as the German crew below deck were frantically attempting to seal themselves in and initiate the self-destruct sequence. The element of surprise was extremely brief, lasting only seconds, before the entire action became a close-quarters knife fight for control of the steel tube. The German defenders fought with a desperation born of both duty and the knowledge that their secrets were on the verge of being compromised. The boarding parties were fully aware that this brutal engagement was fundamentally different from any land combat, as failure meant sinking into the icy depths with their prize. With the conning tower secured and the upper deck under control, the Royal Marines faced their next immense challenge, breaching the heavily secured iron hatches. The interior of the U-boat was a maze of narrow passages and watertight doors, designed to be easily sealed from within to protect the vessel during a depth charge attack. Now, those same mechanisms were being used by the trapped German crew to thwart the boarding action and buy time to scuttle their vessel. The inner hatch was often locked or even welded shut by the desperate German sailors, forcing the Marines to use specialized breaching tools and explosives. Small, focused charges were carefully applied to the reinforced steel, requiring extreme precision to blow the lock without damaging the sensitive equipment inside. The sound of the explosion in the confined space of the conning tower would be deafening, momentarily disorienting the Marines and the crew inside the hull. The explosion's flash would cut through the dim, red emergency lighting, adding to the chaotic, sensory overload of the assault. Once the breach was made, the Marines poured into the hot, humid, and diesel fume-filled interior of the submarine, plunging into the darkness. This was the most dangerous phase, as the fighting moved from the deck to the close quarters, hand-to-hand combat in the cramped compartments. Every turn could hide a resisting German sailor, and every door could lead to a flooded compartment or a booby trap. The primary focus remained securing the radio room and the captain's cabin, which were the repositories for the crucial Enigma materials. The Marines had to simultaneously engage the remaining German crew, search for the code books, and locate and disable the scuttling valves. This required a split-second decision-making process, prioritizing intelligence capture over merely neutralizing all resistance in the hull. The entire operation was a race against the incoming seawater and the final act of defiance by the German crew to destroy their secrets. The moment of truth arrived when the Royal Marines finally located the Enigma machine and the associated signal heft, or short signal book, within the submarine. This was the singular, priceless objective that justified the entire, terrifying risk of the boarding operation in the middle of the Atlantic. The Enigma machine itself was a heavy, electromechanical device, and the code books were often fragile, water-sensitive paper that had to be handled with extreme care. A designated Marine officer, trained specifically for this recovery, would secure the items in a custom-designed, heavily waterproofed canvas bag. The preservation of these materials was paramount, as even a small amount of seawater could render the paper code sheets illegible and useless for the code breakers. This intelligence haul represented an almost unbelievable windfall for the Allies and their secret operation at Bletchley Park. The capture of the Enigma keys meant that for a period of time, the British intelligence community could read German U-boat communications almost in real time. This sudden and unprecedented access to the enemy's plans became known as ultra intelligence, providing the Allies with a massive, decisive advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. The entire network of German wolf packs, their patrol areas, their targets, and their resupply schedules were suddenly laid bare for the British Navy. Admiral Donit's carefully constructed strategy of impenetrable secrecy was instantly shattered, though he remained entirely unaware of the true reason for the sudden change in Allied fortunes. The boarding party's physical courage had provided the intellectual key that would unlock the U-boat war's greatest mystery and turn the tide against the German submarines. The Marines who secured the prize were not celebrated publicly, their valor remaining a deep, dark secret for decades after the war's conclusion. Their successful mission ensured that countless Allied merchant ships and thousands of lives would be saved from the unseen killers beneath the waves. The captured materials were quickly transferred back to the escort vessel and rushed to Bletchley Park, where the wheels of the intelligence war turned instantly in the Allies' favor. The entire German U-boat campaign was fundamentally underpinned by a profound and fatal overconfidence in the operational security provided by their Enigma system. Grand Admiral Donitz genuinely believed that his U-boats were operating under a protective blanket of an unbreakable code that made their communications totally secure. This hubris led to a dangerous strategic complacency, where the possibility of a direct intelligence breach through capture was deemed virtually impossible. The German leadership assumed that the sheer difficulty of finding, disabling, and boarding a U-boat at sea would always protect their secret cipher technology. They underestimated the desperation of the Allies and, critically, they underestimated the exceptional fighting spirit and specialized training of the Royal Marines. The very idea of a small, highly trained unit successfully executing a boarding operation in the chaos of a full naval engagement was dismissed as a fantasy. This belief meant that no adequate countermeasures or self-destruct protocols were universally implemented across the fleet to deal with the threat of capture. The German crews were trained to scuttle their boats, but the process was not instantaneous, leaving a crucial, life-saving window for the determined Marine commandos. This systemic failure to recognize the potential for a direct intelligence threat allowed the British to exploit the momentary operational vulnerability of the surfaced U-boat. Had the Germans installed rapid, irreversible self-destruct charges, the Royal Marines' missions would have almost certainly failed, and many men would have been lost. The confidence in Enigma was so absolute that no one in the German high command could conceive that the source of their problems was not a failure of their own tactics but a massive intelligence leak. They began to attribute their sudden, catastrophic losses to superior Allied radar technology or sheer bad luck, never suspecting the truth of the boarding parties. This deep-seated misjudgment of their enemy's capability to execute such a high-stakes, unorthodox maneuver ultimately contributed directly to the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. The bravery of a few dozen men directly shattered the foundation of Donit's entire naval war strategy and exposed his fleet's greatest secret. The information captured by the Royal Marines on the decks of those U-boats immediately began to reverberate through the silent, invisible intelligence war being waged in secret. At Bletchley Park, the captured Enigma keys and codebooks were meticulously analyzed and then used to set up the immense computing power of the British code-breaking machines. The ultra secret was born, giving the Allies real-time, actionable intelligence on every U-boat operation in the Atlantic. This intelligence completely neutralized the German Wolfpack tactics, allowing Allied convoys to be secretly rerouted around known concentrations of submarines. The naval escorts, previously hunting blind, were now being quietly directed by Ultra to the exact positions of the U-boats, turning the hunter into the hunted. The sinking rate of Allied ships dropped dramatically, while the loss rate of German U-boats soared to unsustainable levels, rapidly depleting Donit's fleet. The war at sea was fundamentally transformed by the capture of these few code materials, shifting the balance of power from the German submarine to the Allied intelligence community. The success of the Royal Marines was the final, critical piece of the puzzle that the code breakers at Bletchley Park desperately needed to achieve a permanent breakthrough. It was a powerful demonstration of how physical courage on the front lines could directly translate into strategic victory in the hidden world of espionage and cryptology. The entire operation, from the moment the U-boat was forced to the surface to the delivery of the codebooks, remained classified for decades after the war ended. The Marines who participated received no public recognition for their actions, ensuring the Germans would never learn the true cause of their sudden strategic disaster. Their silence was as important as their bravery, preserving the ultra-secret that was essential for the entire Allied war effort across multiple theaters of operation. The Royal Marines' willingness to board U-boats under fire was a singular moment where audacity, technology, and sheer human courage converged to change the course of history. The legacy of the Royal Marines' U-boat boarding operations is not solely found in the captured Enigma machines, but also in the formation of modern special operations forces. These early missions established a new doctrine of high-risk, high-value maritime interdiction that is still taught and practiced by elite units across the world today. The blend of naval expertise, commando training, and a focus on intelligence gathering became the blueprint for subsequent special warfare units. The men who carried out these missions were the forerunners of today's highly specialized maritime counterterrorism and special reconnaissance teams. Their exploits, once a closely guarded secret, are now a fundamental part of the Marine Corps' celebrated and storied history of unorthodox warfare. The courage required to board a hostile submarine in a storm, knowing the crew would fight to the last, remains an almost mythical standard of military bravery. The Royal Marines, through this desperate act, cemented their reputation as a force capable of executing the most impossible and audacious missions imaginable. They proved that even the most secure and technologically advanced enemy systems are vulnerable to a determined and highly skilled human assault. Their contribution to winning the Battle of the Atlantic cannot be overstated, as their captures gave the Allies the advantage needed to keep the vital supply lines open. The ability to read the enemy's mail was a war-winning advantage, and that ability was physically delivered by the hands of these few, extraordinary commandos. Decades later, as the full story of Ultra and the U-boat captures was finally declassified, the true scope of their heroism could finally be appreciated by the world. They were the unsung heroes of the intelligence war, risking everything not for a battlefield victory, but for the priceless, fragile secrets within a steel hull. The story of the Royal Marines boarding U-boats under fire stands as a timeless testament to the power of human initiative and courage against overwhelming odds.